Welcome to Leaders and Loggers, the podcast that quenches your thirst for leadership knowledge one pint at a time. Grab your favorite brew, sit back, and join us as we raise a glass to the world of leadership. I'm your host, Kevin Dawson, and each week we'll bring you refreshing conversations with leadership experts from around the globe. We'll dive into the minds of CEOs, thought leaders, and change makers, sipping on the secrets of their success. From the boardroom to the brewery, our guests share their unique perspectives on what it takes to lead in today's ever-changing world. Well, welcome to Leaders and Loggers, and today I am joined by a new friend of mine, Lara Jones. Lara is a keynote speaker, a 5-time Stevie Award-winning leadership performance expert, CEO, athlete, sales expert, neuroscience coach, and author of the book Hunt or Be Hunted. Lara, welcome to Leaders and Loggers.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Wow, what an introduction. Thank you so much.
I'm so honored that you would join me on the podcast. It's been such a neat experience for me to have met you not too long ago in Fort Worth with our good mutual friends, Brian and Gabrielle Boucher. And I got a chance to hear little bits and pieces of your story, and I have to know more, and I want our audience to know more. But before we jump into your story and our conversation, today, I am bringing onto the podcast the Royal Scandal, an English-style pale ale from Peticolas Brewing in Dallas. And I picked this one because I know you are from England, who then came over to the U.S. And so, Lara, cheers, and thank you for joining me for a pint and conversation today.
Cheers to you, Kevin. I don't have the Royal Scandal beer, but what I do have is my water that I carry with me absolutely everywhere. This is half a gallon, and I fill this up 3 times a day. So there you go.
I will say, not only do I have an award-winning guest, but this is an award-winning beer. This is a gold, won gold at the Great American Beer Festival.
Well,
so
of course it is. It's British. I mean, what can I say? Us Brits, we just take it over the world.
There's nobody who matches Texans as much as the Brits do when it comes to just brash and boldness.
I love it. See, well, I'll tell you, that's one thing that you can expect from me, Kevin, is I'm always going to be honest and tell you what it is that is real, not what you want to hear.
Love it. Love it. All right, Lara, for our audience, I'd love for them to just kind of hear your story, because you've got this amazing story that I got to hear bits and pieces of, but I'd love for them to hear your story.
Absolutely. And I'd be honored to share it. Well, Kevin, here's the thing. A lot of people know me for grit, right? And I'll go into my story and as to why. But the truth is, I really didn't want to be the expert in grit. I've had a lot of traumas in my timeline, including my youngest son passing away 2 years ago, and I nearly lost my life the same night. I'll delve into that story in a little bit, but I also came to a foreign country because I'm from England, and I came to America. But I ultimately did that because I wanted to leave a traumatized past behind me. And there were other moments, other reasons as to why I wanted to do that. And really, it's about I wanted to choose my grit, right? Because without choosing my grit, I wasn't sure how I was going to overcome any other grit that was going to choose me based on what I'd already been through in my life. And trust me, Kevin, when I came to this country, I didn't even know I was going to sleep at times. There were 3 days where I couldn't eat, because I didn't have the money to, and it was a choice between having a roof over my head or eating, and I chose to have a roof over my head because I didn't think I'd survive for one night out on the streets as a woman. And it's in those moments, and especially after I lost my son and nearly my life, I realized not long after that I actually had something that many people don't, and that is grit. And I'm not just talking about grit in how Angela Duckworth describes grit, from 10 years ago about passion and perseverance. I'm talking about grit as an acronym, G.R.I.T, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But I actually talk about that in my book, Hunt or Be Hunted, and it's called the Grit System. Is something that I actually developed. But the night that I lost my youngest son, Kevin, for me, that was an awakening moment. It was like a pivotal time, pivotal moment, I should say, in my timeline, where I lay dying on a hospital bed and my organs were shutting down one by one. And I remember sitting bolt upright and I just said to my husband, get me water, I'm going to die. And he said, you're going to have surgery. You can't have water. And it was in that moment where the machines hadn't picked up what was actually going on, right? And all of a sudden, my vision started tunneling, my hearing started going, my speech started slurring. And I tried to hit the button for the nurse, but my coordination went and I couldn't even hit the button. So I tried to shout out nurse as best I could. And remember, this is during COVID times, right? So I was in like an isolated room as well. And I just thought, if I don't take responsibility of this situation right now, I'm going to die, because my husband doesn't realize the severity of this right now because he's not feeling what I'm feeling. And I'm trying to shout nurse as best I can. She comes running in. She shines a flashlight in my eyes and realizes my pupils are not dilating. They're not responding. And she all of a sudden starts, she runs out the room. She starts screaming, emergency blood transfusion, emergency blood transfusion. I was bleeding internally. And all of a sudden the blood pressure machine just started going crazy and plummeting. And every beep, every flash was a lower number and a lower number and a lower number. And it got to 53/37, Kevin, 53/37. And it was in that moment that I knew I was about to die, because my grandma had passed away with her blood pressure plummeting like that. So I knew the moment it got into the 40s/20s, that was it. I was gone. And I had two choices. I had two choices in that moment. Number one, I could have just said, okay, I accept it. I'm going to die. Number two, I accept it, but I also have the belief that they're going to resuscitate me. And what can I do to control the situation between now and then? I can't do anything physically, but the only thing I control is up here, right? Is my mind. So I did something called the 5-4-3-2-1 technique, which I transported myself back into the bedroom of my boys' room. And I just imagined, what are the 5 things I can see? What's the 4 things that I can hear? What are the 3 things I can feel? 2 things I can smell? 1 thing I can touch? And it tricked my brain into thinking that I was actually back at home with my boys, and it calmed me. It actually slowed my heart rate down, because if I panicked, I'd have just died quicker. So it calmed my, it slowed my heart rate down. My blood pressure suddenly stopped plummeting. And it just allowed, it really did help save my life, because it allowed extra time for the nurses to figure out how to get this 16 gauge needle into my collapsed veins with the blood that saved my life. And if I hadn't have done that, quite honestly, I would have flatlined. And who knows, would they have been able to bring me back? I hope so, but we'll never know. And so as I was laying and going through all those motions of, okay, well, I'm going to die. I have to accept this, but they're going to resuscitate me. I want to be with my boys. I'm just going to trick my brain. So I was reframing how I was thinking about the situation. And I thought, okay, if I get through this, right, if I make it out of this alive, I will make it my mission to impact at least one person for at least one day for every day that I'm breathing. And I've never gone back on that, Kevin.
There's not very many stories that kind of almost leave me speechless. And this is one of those moments, to hear your story, to hear the tragedy, the trauma, but really to hear the resilience of mindset. I think as leaders, the mind and how we think really sets the tone for how we're able to not just only lead other people, but lead ourselves. And to hear how, how you were able to use your mindset and shift into, I can panic and I can accept this, or okay, what can I do? And shifting your mindset into, all right, that's the only thing I have control over. So let's shift the mindset into this to calm things down and give yourself an opportunity to have the experts in the hospital staff do their best to be able to save your life at that point in time. I think that says a lot about how important our minds are in the way that we think about things as leaders in order to deal with extreme challenges. Maybe not dying in a hospital, but how do we deal with major challenges, in our daily lives or in our work?
And that's a great point that you bring up, Kevin. And that's actually how I started to develop the GRIT system, right? And if I may, I'm just going to run through what the acronym is.
Go ahead.
So the G in grit is get it done, right? I've always been a very get it done type person. It's something needs to happen. No one else is going to do it for you. You need to go out there and just get it done, right? If you wait, well, the same thing that you have to do is still going to be there, later on. So just get it done. Just figure it out, work it out. Whether it's you need to have a strategy or whatever it may be, you just got to get it done, right? You got to have that motivation to be able to do that. That's where a lot of people may struggle is, well, I'm just not motivated to go do that. Why they're not motivated? Because they don't have the belief that they can, right? And there's a whole story around that. So the G in my grit is get it done, right? The R in my grit, which I've just given an example of, is reframe thinking. So in other words, like no matter the situation, obviously the one I just shared was incredibly tragic. And, I hope that no one has to go through what I went through. But the reality is people do, right? And we can't ignore that. But even in leadership, in a team, the people that you surround yourselves with, whether you're at home with your family, whether you're with friends, if you're in the corporate world, it doesn't really matter where you are, you're going to have some type of situation or adversity come up, and it's how you view that situation, right? And so the R and the grit is reframe thinking. If you control what your thoughts or you control your thoughts, you're going to control your life. You have the choice in how to handle how that situation impacts your thinking, and that thinking impacts your behavior. And so, this is like a vicious circle. It goes on and on. And actually, through a lot of the research that I've carried out, as part of the book, the 100 Be 100 book, is that around 80% of our thoughts are actually negative. Can you believe that? 80% are negative. And around 90% are repetitive. So if we think about that for a moment, 80% of our thoughts are negative, 90% are repetitive.
There's a lot of negative thoughts just going through our heads.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly, Kevin. Exactly. And so I realized something, that in that moment when, and I'm going to use the that night that I nearly lost my life and, my son had passed away, I said to myself, I had to reframe how I was thinking about the situation. And obviously it didn't happen right in that moment, but, it was shortly thereafter that I said to myself, look, I've got two ways of looking at this. I can either feel really sorry for myself and kind of get deeper into this dark hole and not emerge either the same Lara or a better version of Lara. Well, the other option is you stop making it about yourself and you make it about others. And I started reframing my thinking around that, and I just said, okay, my son doesn't get to breathe the air that I breathe. He doesn't get to smile the way that I get to smile. He doesn't get to laugh the way that I laugh. He doesn't even get to experience crying the way that I cry. He doesn't get to do any of that. He'll never get to grow up and get married one day and have children. I've lost out on potential grandchildren from him. But here's the thing. If I continued being in this deep, dark hole and just making it all about myself, then how is that serving him? How is that serving others that have gone through something similar to myself? Or even others that have gone through the worst in their life, which everyone's gone through some level of adversity. It doesn't really matter how bad or how, trivial, if you will, like the situation, it's adversity, right? And so that's how I really started to develop the R in my grit. And also, I do have a bachelor's and master's in psychology and mental health counseling. And so obviously I learned a lot of reframing and cognitive behavioral therapy, if you will, many, many, many years ago. So a lot of this does stem, right back to those days. And obviously I've carried out a huge amount of research. And I was also diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of what I'd gone through. And one of the most effective treatments for that is actually reframing your thinking. It's CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So the R in my grit is reframe your thoughts. And I go into it extensively in my book. I give multiple different examples of, well-known others, some major companies that I interviewed as well, to attribute it to leadership. And when you're dealing with adversity within a team, or not even potentially adversity, but how do you even, how do you protect the adversity from even happening, right? How do you protect the team from that? And then the I in the grit is all about impacting others. And I just said, earlier, that when you stop making it about yourself and you make it about others, you realize that in doing so, yes, you're impacting yourself, but impacting others is a huge part of grit, because as a leader, that's your job. Like, you have to be protective of your team, number one, but also how are you impacting that team? So how you think is how they're going to think. How you behave is how they're going to behave, right? So you always got to think, okay, how am I impacting others? And again, I go into it extensively in the book, but the T in my grit is all about taking responsibility and taking ownership. And I'll just give you the analogy when I said earlier, as I was laying there dying on the hospital bed, and my husband is saying, no, you can't have water because you're going to have surgery. And he's not obviously realizing the gravity of the situation. And that's when I said, well, I got to take responsibility of this, because if I don't, I'm going to die. But as a leader in the corporate world, if you don't take ownership and you don't take responsibility, your team are going to fail. Because there's a saying, Kevin, a fish smells from the head, right? It starts with you. It starts with the leader. And quite frankly, that has got to be one of the most important parts of leadership. Is you got to take ownership in what you do. You got to take responsibility for your actions. You also got to take responsibility for your inaction. Because as I said, whatever you do, your team are going to follow and they're going to believe. So if you want to instill motivation, you got to instill the belief in your team that they can do it. How do you do that? You got to create awareness and an environment to allow them to have the autonomy to learn in the way that they learn, right? And I can go into that a little bit later, but there's huge scientific evidence for this. And I've basically pieced it all together, and I've created a process of grit. So, I've identified the 4 elements of grit, got the process of grit, and I've also identified the 4 types of grit. And the best way to kind of think about it is, the different personality tests, which I'll be quite honest with you, every single personality assessments out there, they all stem back to Carl Jung in the 1930s, like the 4 different personality types. And so all of those assessments can basically be rooted back to that particular research and that data. And so the grit system is almost like the DISC assessment, but it's in grit, right? And what does that do? It instills in your team that everybody has a level of grit. And why is that important? Well, now you're creating the belief in them that they do have a level of grit, which motivates them to want to learn more about, how do I strengthen this level of grit? And how do I learn the other areas of grit? What does that do? Well, it influences their cognition. What does that do? It alters the way they think. It literally alters their brain processes. It rewires their brain. And that allows them then to have a more positive attitude, to adopt a growth mindset, which ultimately is going to lead to the application of the grit system. So again, Kevin, I could spend hours talking to you about this. I'm very passionate about it, but it gives you a very brief overview.
I'm sitting here just taking notes left and right. I'm like, there is so much going on right here. I'm like, I need to get Hunter be hunted so I can better understand this, and then call you back. Okay, let's talk about this. but I've been making some notes and some things that you said that I want to kind of come back to, as you've outlined what grit is, how you've defined it: get it done, reframe thinking, inspire others, taking responsibility,
Impact others.
Impact others. That's right. Impact others. And I starting with get it done like this, I think leaders struggle here because we get it's paralysis by analysis. Sometimes we we overthink how do people handle these things. And it was interesting. I recently did another personality assessment. It was the Strengths Finder assessment. Somebody said, "Hey, we want everybody to do this for an organization." And for me, one of those was self-assurance. Like, I know what needs to happen and I'm going to do it. And sometimes that can be kind of off-putting to other people. Like I was involved in a nonprofit board, and we hosted an event, and I was asked to lead that event. And so as we worked through that for the last several months to pull off this inaugural event, I'm like, we've got to get things done. The time for discussing and evaluating, like that's gone. We had to shift and pivot because there were things that came up that needed to shift and pivot 3 weeks ahead of from the event. Like, no, we've got to make this choice. I'm going to get it done. I'm making an executive order. This is what we're doing. And people are like, we don't like that. I'm like, that's what leaders have to do sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I think that to understand as leaders, sometimes you just have to trust your intuition and get it done.
100%.
Or you won't get it done.
No, exactly. It comes down to, and this is why, and I'm glad you brought that up, because earlier, when I was telling my story and after you introduced me and I said about how I came to this country and I kind of chose my grit and so forth, it relates back to that. It's in order to get something done. If you choose your own grit before it chooses you, it helps teach you the tools, as to what you need to do when a situation happens like the one you just gave, right? When a decision needs to be made and it needs to be made quickly, under time pressure, some people will thrive on that. And then there's going to be others that really buckle and they're not quite sure how to do that. But what if you could learn the skills like within the grit? So what I was saying earlier with the grit system, what if you could learn those skills and choose your own grit? So then when grit chooses you, you're able to perform right under that. So it's an extremely important part, like pillar, if you will, of the grit system, because if you don't get things done, what's going to happen, right? Decisions don't get made, or the wrong decisions get made, or no decision gets made, right? How's it going to impact the team? How's it going to impact others? So, but here's the thing, Kevin, one of the biggest reasons as to why people really struggle to get anything done, and I mentioned it earlier, is they just don't have the motivation to do it. Why don't they have the motivation to do it? Because they don't have the belief. And why don't they have the belief? Because they don't have the confidence. And it all comes down to building up their confidence to be able to have the belief to get them motivated, which is going to influence how they think about a situation, right? So it's all very interconnected. You can kind of see where the R comes in, the I comes in, the T comes in, and it's all linked, right? You can't really do one without the other. Now you're going to be more dominant in an area, and that's what I've actually developed the grit type indicator assessment. And so people can go to that assessment and take the assessment, and they'll actually see which part of grit they're more dominant in. So if they are more dominant in the G and the get it done, they also have to learn, okay, well, how do I enhance my performance in the R, the I, and the T? Because not every situation is going to warrant all aspects of grit, right? And so the example you just gave, Kevin, you absolutely need to have the G, right? So if you are typically, say, an I, right, where you're impacting others and, you've got tremendous skills around that, that's great. But how do we pull from, in that moment, we need to pull from the G in the grit, not the I. So how do we do that? And that's where the grit system comes in, teaches techniques and tools to be able to do that.
I love that. It's interesting how the next one, reframe thinking. I recently got a chance to visit with our mutual friend Laura Weirs, and talking about just how important it is to reframe your thinking, especially when dealing with trauma and triggers. And how even before we started talking, you shared a story how you've reframed your thinking around your birthday and your anniversary, and went and saw Top Gun Maverick, which you and I both share a big love of. So does Brian Boucher. Brian and I talked about Top Gun Maverick for, I think we still text each other about Top Gun Maverick.
I love it. I love it.
But just the importance of, reframing your thinking. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you forget what happened. You just reframe how you view what happened, and how that helps you move forward.
Yeah, Absolutely. I cannot stress that the R in grit is incredibly important. In fact, it's probably the most important for people because of that stat that I shared earlier, where 80% of our thoughts are negative and 90% are repetitive. We have to work really, really hard, to be able to look at a situation and reframe how you think. I mean, Kevin, my son passed away and I nearly lost my life. How on earth do you come back from that, right? I had a lot of people ask me that. How do you even reframe that thinking? But here's the thing, and I've talked a lot about this, I obviously post a lot on LinkedIn. And so I share, quite a bit of, my thoughts around how you reframe and obviously research. And I share a lot of that. And a lot of it's in the book as well. But the way that people often view a situation is perception, right? It's their perception of what's happened. Whatever that perception may be is automatically going to impact your thought process. And because we're automatically wired that way, it's a survival instinct, because 10,000 years ago, if you were like, if you suddenly heard a rustling in the trees, it was most likely a predator, right? And so if you didn't think, oh no, that's just a little mouse or something, it's, if you don't think the way that, oh, there's something that could eat me here, you're going to die, right? So our brains are just doing what they're supposed to do, which is protecting us. And that, I mean, although that can be helpful, in certain situations now, not that, a lion's about to go eat you in the bushes or something, but you know what I'm saying, right? It can still serve a purpose now. However, majority of the time, it can hurt us, right? It can hinder us, but our brains don't know any better unless we teach them. So you have to be able to give information to your brain to allow it to evolve. It's all about getting into that growth mindset state, right? And coming out of that comfort zone, getting into your fear zone. And when you're in that fear zone, it's not running back into the comfort zone because things get tough. It's, okay, how do we reframe how we think to continue pushing through that fear zone? Because once you do that, you get into what we call your learning zone. And when you're in a learning zone, that's where the magic happens. That's where you start rewiring your thought processes. It's where your brain starts getting rewired. You may have come across the saying that neurons that fire together wire together. It's very true. And so you can rewire your thinking all the way up until the day you die. You could be 120 years old and still learn how to rewire your brain and achieve it. And when you do that with your learning zone, it then gets you into, your growth zone. And that's where a lot of people struggle, because they're like, well, how do I get from A to B, as in, your comfort zone to your growth zone? I'm like, well, you're missing a few zones. That's why you can't just jump from one to the other. And that's where the reframing, comes into it. You can't skip the fear zone and you can't skip the learning zone. Without those two, you're never going to get into the growth zone. So that's why R in the grit is a huge component of it, because that's where a lot of the magic happens, and how you reframe how you think about a situation. And it's very applicable in the corporate world and in team settings, because a challenge might come your way and you're not quite sure how to overcome that. Well, that's why you want to have multiple members of your team, some that are specialized in the R and grit. Because if you don't have those particular members in your team, you're going to struggle unless you know how to pull from the R in the grit.
Love it. I love it. And I love how, when you reframed your thinking to say, okay, if I get out of this, I want to impact at least one person a day for as long as I live. And I think, the idea of impacting others, one, at the heart of leadership, we have to be able to impact others, or we aren't leaders. Because if we don't have people who choose to follow us, who are we leading? And so to say, hey, I want to impact others, and I think sometimes we put too big of an idea of, well, I want to impact hundreds of people or thousands of people. Like, no, sometimes it just needs to be one person.
Right. And in fact, I've just been talking about this recently, but the I in grit about impacting others is, how are you inspiring your team? How are you inspiring others? And it's not even, I just want to take it a step further, because I know you said about, like, how are others going to follow if you're not inspiring them or impacting them? I kind of see it as, it's not even that others are going to follow you. It's that I'm trying to build them up to be able to impact their team members or others around them, or even in their home environment, impact their friends, their family. Because if you just impact my mission when I was laying there dying on the hospital bed is, if I can impact at least one person for at least one day for every day I'm breathing, that's what I'm going to focus on. That's what I'm going to do. And I've never looked back on that. And that's for a reason. Because even if you just impact at least one person, Kevin, think how many people that could impact. Like a smile, for example, right? If I smile at someone, I could be going through the worst day of my life. If I smile at someone, the impact that has on somebody else. In fact, this actually did happen to me recently. I was out locally, and I happened to see someone I hadn't seen in quite some time, and I smiled at her, and we got talking, and she actually sent me a message later that day, and she said, "Seeing your smile made my day." And that uplifted her, feelings and behavior and thoughts and actions. And so she went on, she actually told me this, she went on and she started passing that on. She felt so energized from our conversation, and just, from hearing different stories and just laughing and smiling, that she then wanted to share that with others. And so one person, you think, if you're impacting one person, how many others around her is she now impacting? And then how many others are those people impacting? And so on and so on and so on, right? So it spreads. And you got to ask yourself as a leader, who are you inspiring? Who are you impacting? Because if you're not, are you really a leader?
Ooh,
And that's how
good
yeah.
question. Good question.
That's how the I and grit evolved.
Yeah, it makes me think of, a good friend of mine who is a former NFL running back. And when we were in college together, he got injured our freshman year and had to sit out. And while he was there, he started to write creatively in the newspapers, said, "Hey, we want you to do a weekly article for us." So he started writing and he just kind of shared his thoughts on what was going on in his life. And he grew up in a very poor home, had a lot of struggle, a lot of trauma in there. And there was a particular article he wrote that really, I think, underlies this whole impact others and the importance of just one person is all that needs to be impacted by. And he shares this story. He was at the grocery store, and a guy comes up to him out of the blue, goes, "Hey, you're so and so, right?" And he says, "Yeah." I said, I don't mean to catch you off guard, but you saved my life." And he goes, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I was getting ready to take my life, and I set out a newspaper to make sure that the mess wasn't all over the place, whoever found my body. And I just happened to look down, and there was this story of you dealing with the adversity you were going through and how you overcame that. And I sat there and I read it, and I put the gun down."
Wow.
And he said,
Wow.
I just want to say thank you." And he walked away. And just how a simple moment of impacting one person can have a ripple effect.
100%. That's why, I mean, honestly, even if you just, if it doesn't even seem like it's a huge thing for you to do that day, flashing a smile at somebody can change their world, or having them hear your story can save their life. And that's what I mean. Like, this is something that is, everybody needs to be aware of, that whether you're a leader, whether you're a team member, whether you are a mother, a father, whether you're a college student, whether you're just, somebody in the world somewhere that thinks that they don't have some level of grit, right? If you impact others in just the smallest way, then you've got a level of grit, because it takes grit to be able to do that, right? In that moment.
Yep.
And with you doing that, now you've just impacted somebody else that could impact somebody else that could impact somebody else, right? Just like you said, Kevin, the ripple effect. So yeah, it's very powerful.
And then I kind of laughed a little bit internally when you were talking about as you took responsibility for yourself, and you're like, "My husband just said, well, you have surgery." Like, isn't that such a typical guy moment for a second?
Oh my gosh. He likes to be right. And so of course, was he right in that moment? Yes, of course he is, because it could have killed me had I gone into surgery, and I could have choked on what, of course, right? But oh my gosh, if there was one moment that I did not want him to be right, it would have been that moment.
But just goes to
Oh,
show, I think even when somebody who is thinking logically, they're not the ones taking ownership of the situation.
correct, correct, correct. And Kevin, if I hadn't have done that, I mean, I probably would be dead, quite frankly, or I would have had to trust that they would have resuscitated me, but they probably wouldn't have been able to without getting that blood in me. And that took quite a while because my veins had collapsed. It was like a knock-on effect. It was pretty horrific. And so, yeah, I mean, if I had not taken that responsibility or taken ownership of that situation, I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking with you today.
Which it just goes to show how important it is as leaders. We have to take ownership of the things that we have control of. It just
Yeah.
it circles back to the top.
Yeah.
To get it done.
Here's another example, because this happened fairly recently, but obviously you mentioned at the beginning I'm an athlete, right? And I actually got, competitions that I do throughout. I do high rocks competitions. It's kind of like functional fitness. Some people might think it's like CrossFit. I like to describe it as CrossFit on steroids. But anyway, I do a grueling training session every single day, sometimes twice a day, especially when there's competitions coming up. And I can generally work out anywhere between 7 to 9 times a week. 'Cause I do some one-on-one training as well for some technique work. And I work super hard at what I do, and I put 100% into everything that I do. And as a result, there was one training session I did, and I wasn't really listening to my body in that moment. I just wanted to push through because I was like, just get it done, and you got to get it done for your team. So in the G in my grit, right? But in that moment, I really should have pulled from my T and grit, because I should have taken responsibility of the fact that my body had started going into a shutdown mode. I started shaking. I basically had muscle fatigue. And so as a result, my form was off and I injured myself pretty badly. And I was out for 5 weeks. I still trained. I just couldn't do what I usually would do. And I was out for 5 weeks. Well, I met an incredible performance physio. She's part of our community, part of what I call my culture of excellence. Her name's Sarah Powell. She's amazing. She's not a normal physio. She is someone that's super duper duper educated in all of this. And had I not seen her and taken responsibility to say, Sarah, I need you to help me. And it took me a week to do that, right? So, there's certain aspects of that T that I had to work on. But when you take responsibility of your situation, and I realized that I cannot continue training this way because long term, I would suffer immensely and probably not be able to compete. But I took responsibility and started listening to my body, and I took ownership of the situation. Now, anyone that knows me knows I'm a lion, right? I'm that lioness. And if you try to stop me from doing something that I really want to do, you're caging me, right? I feel like now I'm a lion in a cage. Yeah, it's not good, right? It's not a pretty sight. And I had to learn. I had to use the R in my grit. I had to reframe how I thought about the situation. I said, and even Sarah said to me, she was like, what do you want? Short-term goals or long-term goals? Which ones do you want to hit? Because you want to hit short-term goals, sure, let's go back at it and go back at it hard. And, she'll help, after each session. Or do you want long-term goals? Which means we have to reframe and restructure the process of what I'm doing in my training. And so, of course, I'm still young. And so I, obviously want the long-term effects of that. But really that just shows that even, in athleticism, the same principle applies, right? You've got to take responsibility of your situation and realize that because I didn't listen to my body in that moment, I injured myself. Now I've put myself out for 5 weeks and it's put my training behind slightly. Now I have to work even harder to get back to where I was, and the competition date doesn't change, right? And I'm committed to that. So taking responsibility is a huge part, again, of the grit, and the same can be applied in leadership and with your team. Because if you don't take responsibility and take ownership, what do? You break the trust. And if you don't have trust as a leader, you don't have a team.
I fully agree with everything that you just said. I do want to pivot just a little bit. So we've talked about grit, but part of your book in terms of developing grit is so you can learn to lead like a legend. And I would love for you to kind of share, what does lead like a legend mean?
Well, I'll give you a little history of why I use the word legend so much. Obviously, I'm from England, and we do use that word fairly frequently over there. It's a pretty well used word over there. But you know, a legend to me is someone that, again, they get it done, they reframe how they think about things, they impact others, and they take responsibility. And when you master all four of those areas, you really do exhibit the behavior of someone that is not just a leader, but someone that once you're long gone, right, others can look up to and say, I really want to be able to instill the principles that they instilled in their life. Or, you know what, this is really difficult in my life, but they got through this and they did that. And how did they do that? And there was a system around that. And so when I was in England, and I worked for one of my very first jobs, I worked for a fantastic company, and I'm still friends with the prior owner of that organization and my prior sales director and so forth, and quite a few others as well that I work with in the team. Fantastic, phenomenal people. I'm so grateful for that time. And I remember, saying to the owner of that company, I'm like, why are we not like getting into some of the big boys? Because we're like, we're dealing with all the smaller companies, but why are we not with some of the big well-known names? And some of the thought process around that was, well, it's very difficult to compete against them, on price and on this and that. And I said, yeah, but it's not about price. It's about the value that you're bringing them, right? So I started immediately, even from a very young age, just reframing the situation and thinking about things very differently, and not seeing the product as just a product, but as an experience, for the end consumer. And so, anyway, I basically, I was like this young little whippersnapper, that came in and basically kind of started biting at the heels of others. And I was just, I was in sales, and I just progressed at a very, very fast rate. And I was suddenly booking double the appointments that everybody else was. And all of a sudden the gross profit of my deals was far higher than many others. And I was just, ramping up sales like nobody's business. And the owner one day just turned around and said, "You're a legend." And so the name legend just kind of stuck with me. So when I came to this country and I was going through some of my hard times, I just remember what he said to me. And his name's Brian, but I remember what Brian said to me. And he just, I kept hearing, "Lara, you're a legend. You can do anything you want to do when you really put your mind to it. Like, you are a legend. You think about things differently. You just get it done. The people you're impacting is immense." And, and also I was taking responsibility of the fact that I was changing things. I was changing the way that people were thinking. And so it was kind of a no-brainer that, when I came to this country and I started my own company and so forth, I wanted the word legend to be in that. So, I have another company called Be a Legend, and the legend part was inspired by my old boss, Brian. So
I love it.
there's the
I
story.
love it. I love it. Well, Laura, it is time for last call. And so for our listeners this week, what is something that they can be doing to be a better leader?
Well, Kevin, that is a really, really great question. And let me just tell you this. So many leaders that I work with feel that they're not getting the respect that they deserve. And therefore they're not getting the results that they desire with themselves and with their team. And quite honestly, Kevin, they feel stuck, right? So the truth is they don't have a system. That's one of the issues. They don't have a system that works with dealing with all of these multiple different personalities that they have in front of them, that usually, you come up against in leadership. And so when you bring all those leaders together, when you bring a team together to make a decision, as an example, it becomes painful. And it's, oftentimes that decisions are either delayed or doesn't get made, or the wrong decision is made. So one of my favorite things to do is to work with companies to teach my system surrounding the most important attribute of leadership, which is grit, by teaching them the grit system, the G.R.I.T in the grit. And I do that through, keynote speaking, workshops, performance programs, but also the grit type indicator assessment, which, quite frankly, it unlocks the doors to all the other hallmarks of leadership. So if you want to become a better leader, buy the book, Hannah Be Hunted, learn the grit system, and then we'll talk.
I love it. I love it. Well, Laura, how can our listeners learn about you, connect with you, find the book?
So the best way, Kevin, to get hold of me or to learn more about the book, just simply text the word grit, G-R-I-T, to 33777. So it's text the word grit to 33777.
Fantastic. Well, Laura, thank you so much for sharing your story, sharing with us the grit system, and one being a friend of mine now, and joining me for a pint and conversation. I really enjoyed all of it today.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I did too. And what a great choice of beer, by the way. I love the fact it's called Royal Scandal as well.
Well, us Americans love a royal scandal.
Oh, I love that. Maybe that's another podcast for another day, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I'm truly honored to have met you and be connected. And thank you for asking me to come on the show today.
It's been my pleasure. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Leaders and Loggers podcast. If you really enjoyed our conversation, please share it with a leader who needs to hear it. And as always, if you've not subscribed to our podcast, we're on all the major streaming sites and on YouTube. And join us next week for another pint in conversation.